Before COVID struck, our wonderful secretary had devised a theme of talks around the collections and collectors. So, of course, with that theme, we knew we had a wonderful reserve of libraries as book collections just at hand, and we secretly hoped that we'd get one of the really special ones. So our beam of attention quickly focused on Corpus as a likely candidate. So we approached Joanna Snelling, who is the college librarian. Indeed, she's in the rather glamorous looking panelled surroundings of a college room there. And I'm very delighted to say that she has agreed to talk. And as you can see, the beginning of her title is already up. So it's of bees and books, and it's a history of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. And with no further ado, I shall turn myself off and disappear and hand over the floor to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I hope people pop up somewhere on Zoom if you can't hear me or if there's anything that fails. My name's Joanna Snelling, as you have heard, and I've been the college librarian here at Corpus Christi College for nearly 20 years. And for those of you with the university connection as well, I'm currently the chair of the Committee of College Librarians, which is a more social thing than it perhaps sounds. But I'm looking forward to talking to you today about the library here and its books. And as we said, there'll be time for questions at the end, hopefully. So 400 years ago, we marked the 500th anniversary of the foundation of the college. And this is a picture of the gatehouse and the front quad, which were built for 1517. And as part of our quincentenary celebrations, we examined our past. A new history of the college was published in 2017, along with A Great Little College, a collection of memories from the second half of the 20th century. And a further publication, An Oxford College at War, Corpus Christi College 1914 to 18, was published in time for the 100 years anniversary of the armistice. So we've been reviewing where we are today, and we're also making plans for the next 500 years. Now, I have less than an hour, obviously, to cover 500 years, so it will be quite a gallop through the history of Corpus Library and its members, with a few highlights and illustrations. And as hopefully you'd expect from a librarian, I'll also refer you to books and to websites where you can find out much more about some of the things I'll mention today. So Corpus was the first truly Renaissance institution of Oxford or Cambridge. It was the last pre-Reformation college, and it focused on the new learning, humanism, which was spreading from Italy and the continent. And the library was fundamental to this humanist programme and was given a key location in the front quad, so it faces you as you enter the college. And it was a library built on the new technology of print, when some of our longer standing neighbours resisted buying printed books until the 1550s. Now, the ambition behind the foundation of this college attracted contemporary interest from humanists on the continent. And any of you a little familiar with the college's history will know I'm leading up to our famous quote, which we always bring out. Only 2 years after the college's foundation, on the 27th of June in 1519, Erasmus, the great Dutch humanist, wrote to John Claymont, the college's first president, saying, "I predict that in the future this college, just like the most holy temple consecrated to the best of learning, will be counted throughout the whole earth among the foremost ornaments of Britain." So high praise indeed. So 500 years or more ago, Erasmus was declaring this trilingual library of the Latin, Greek and Hebrew texts would rival the splendours of Rome and the Vatican Library. And it's something we've been trying to live up to ever since. Now you're probably wondering why of bees and books. And I've taken my lead from the inspirational statutes of the college. Here, in a translation from the Latin, the founder announced that he had founded, reared and constructed a certain bee garden, which we have named the College of Corpus Christi, wherein scholars, like ingenious bees, are by day and night to make wax in the honour of God, and honey, dropping sweetness, to the profit of themselves and of all Christians. This beehive was to be regulated, and its studious and ingenious bees guided and disciplined. Its stated aim was to avoid a superfluous multitude, lest both a lack of knowledge and forgetfulness steal in. While we have remained small, this bee garden continues to grow and thrive, adapting where necessary and remaining relevant and devoted to education today. And as you can see here at the back of the library, the college is also a literal garden, informal and abundant, which in non-COVID times you are welcome to come and enjoy, as it's would normally be open most afternoons. And I would add a word of warning that we do also have bees still resident in the college that live in hives on the top of our auditorium. So who was the man behind the bee garden? Our founder was Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester. Fox was a Lincolnshire man, born around 1448. He became an important statesman, a diplomat and advisor to both Henry VII and Henry VIII, becoming keeper of the Privy Seal. With royal approval, Fox progressed through the wealthiest sees in the church, becoming in order Bishop of Exeter, Bath and Wells, Durham, and then finally Winchester, where he died in 1528. Fox retired from politics in 1516 to concentrate on his ministry at Winchester and his plan to found a college in Oxford. Now, originally his plan was to create a small monastic college for the Benedictine monks of Winchester. Such a foundation would probably not have survived the Reformation in the 1530s. Fortunately, Fox came round to the notion of a college for the secular clergy, so educating men, and of course it was men at that time, for all kinds of roles in society, in both church and the state. This change probably came about through the influence of his friend Hugh Oldham, who's also seen here in the slide, who was Bishop of Exeter and who also made a substantial financial contribution to this foundation, and so can be considered a co-founder with Fox. So although larger than the original monastic foundation plan, the size of Fox's college was still moderate. There were to be 20 fellows and 20 students, or discipli, overseen by the president and tended by 3 lecturers, or right skillful herbalists, as the statutes describe them. The buildings to house them were built on this small site, mainly on land purchased or possibly bribed from Merton College next door. A large part of the college today is made up of buildings that survive from that first phase from 1512 to 1520. So this includes Front Quad with its residential accommodation and the important communal spaces of the hall, the chapel and the library. And this is a 17th century print by Logan, which is probably familiar to many of you. But there is an interesting addition to the corpus entry, which is this chained fox in one of the quads. So a fox for Fox's College. So back to the library, that had a central position in the college in Front Quad, and it is a typical medieval library built on the first floor to make the best of the light and security and avoiding flood risk. So the original part of the library is this kind of long gallery. It's remained in continual use as a library since the foundation, and it is where the current students work today. Although we're one of the smallest undergraduate colleges still, Corpus has, as you'd expect, expanded well beyond the original statutes. There are currently about 250 undergraduates and 115 graduate students, as well as about 40 fellows, and all the staff needed to keep the college running. And the library continues to develop to support the needs of our members, and we're funded to support all the undergraduate courses taught here. Over the centuries, the library has extended beyond its original footprint, and we've taken over space beneath the old library as well as branching sideways into college rooms. And this means we have a variety of desks in the working library. We also have the modern comforts of cushions, electric lights, heating, Wi-Fi, none of which old members can take for granted when they come on visits. So nevertheless, in the original library building today, students are using the library furniture that was installed over 400 years ago. Initially, the library was probably equipped with lecterns where books could be stored flat or read on a sloping desk. The renovation of the library in 1604 saw the, I'm just going to adjust my power. skipped over. Apologies, it won't let me go back very easily, so you'll have to wait to find out about MS-209. So in the original building, today's students are using library furniture that was installed about 400 years ago. Initially, the library was probably equipped with lecterns where books could be stored flat or read on a sloping desk. The renovation of the library in 1604 saw the installation of a new fashion of library furniture, book presses, which is to say bookcases with desks attached that are pressed back to back and stand at right angles to the wall from between the windows. With the benches, these presses form pews or cells for the studious. Ours was originally a chained library, with books secured by chains attached to the lecterns or presses. The metalwork from the chaining can still be seen on the presses today. The statutes made provision for a separate circulating collection, which was a typical college arrangement. The two collections were probably merged when the library was renovated in 1604. Chaining ceased altogether in the mid-18th century as books became smaller and less valuable. And over the centuries, the college has made other changes to the presses, such as increasing the height and adding shelves, which is all helpful for a growing collection. So what is in this library? I'll start with some facts and figures. Ours was a library built, as I said, on the new technology of print. And today the library holds probably the 6th biggest college collection of early printed books in Oxford. And early in our terms are those printed before 1830 in the age of the hand press. So we have about 20,000 such titles, and this includes 280 incunabula, which are the books printed before 1500 in the very first decades of the development of printing in Europe. There are over 4,000 titles printed on the continent before 1641. And a quarter of those continental publications, so about 1,000 titles, are not held by any other Oxford College library. There are also 10,000 British titles from before 1800, and 159 of these editions are unique in the world. There are no other recorded copies. In terms of content, there's a large numbers from the 16th and 17th and 18th century political, historical and theological tracts, including substantial Civil War pamphlets. The library also contains a large collection of ephemeral or vernacular publications. Now, in addition to these historic collections, we shouldn't forget that we also have about 70,000 printed items dating from the 19th to the 21st centuries. These modern books and journals are on the open shelves in the original library and its later extensions, and they're normally available for current members to use 24 hours a day, and for external readers by appointment, although of course times are not normal at the moment. I will come back to the early printed books, but the college also has over 500 manuscripts, so the handwritten books, ranging in date from the 9th century to the 21st. So these manuscripts or handwritten texts are by definition unique, but many in Corpus have a national and international significance. There were some 30 manuscripts in the library by the mid-1530s, but the majority of the 200 or so Western medieval manuscripts we have now were actually presented by donors in the 17th century. So unlike the older colleges, these manuscripts don't reflect the studies of the medieval university with lots of canon law and theological texts. They instead offer an extraordinary variety of subject and date. It was very much a rich collection. I mean, there were some decorated liturgical titles, but also beautifully illuminated medieval works, working and scholarly documents, as well as rare survivals of special bindings. And there are works significant for this country's history and culture, and I will quote a few examples here. So this manuscript that's been tantalizing you here is actually a collection of 12th century religious texts from Fountains Abbey. Now, some of the texts it contains bear witness to the beginnings of the Cistercian monasticism in northern England. But this volume is also important because of the outstanding preservation of its original binding, which includes this sealskin chemise or cover. And it is, you know, as strokeable as it looks. I mean, one doesn't, but one would want to stroke it. You can actually see the way the hairs lie in this chemise. And this manuscript with its cover has been at Corpus for over 300 years. Now the same is true for another treasure. This is a beautifully illuminated 12th century Irish missal or mass book. Now only fragments of its original binding survive, but the text itself was protected by the leather book satchel or budget that it was kept in. But this is actually a satchel from an earlier period. It's a very rare survival. We think the satchel dates from about the 9th century, and it's the only one outside of Ireland, and I think one of only 3 in the world. So it's a very delicate object, as you can imagine, but we're thrilled to be custodians of it. We have another uncommon survival, a 14th century Lapworth missal, which is a rare survival given that medieval English liturgical books were ordered to be destroyed in the Reformation. Now this object is very much a luxurious product with lots of beautiful decoration, including this full-page crucifixion scene with the exceptional, the gold on here is just beautiful, and the whole of the colours are as alive as they look in this picture. And part of that comes from the another exceptional survival, which is its protective silk curtain, which you can just see sort of curled up at the top of the page. Now this manuscript came to the college through Henry Parry, who matriculated or was accepted into the college and university in 1607. Parry presented the college with 38 manuscripts that he probably inherited from his father and namesake, who was also a member of Corpus 30 years earlier. And it was the father who had been successively Bishop of Gloucester and Worcester, and so possibly collected these manuscripts as monasteries closed down. So included in this large donation from Henry Parry is possibly our most significant treasure. So this is the autograph copy of John of Worcester's Chronicle of England. It's a 12th century Latin chronicle and has been described as one of our major sources for the history of England from the death of Bede to the reign of Stephen. And it has rare and striking illuminations. Now there is a crucifixion scene, but more unusually, there is one of the earliest Western depictions of sunspots. And then there are these, the famous dreams of Henry I, as you can see here. The dream sequence has been described as the earliest surviving narrative scenes in an English chronicle. And there's a lot more information about this manuscript and its different illuminations in an article on the Behind the Book Presses section of the College Library website. Now, as is becoming clear, the 17th century was key for donations from college members, particularly those who were antiquarians and collectors. So Brian Twine, as part of his large bequest, gave us a 12th century Old English translation of Bede, once owned by Archbishop Matthew Parker. William Fulman gave a 10th century Latin and Old English rule of St. Benedict. And Fulman also gave us the Middle English texts that are staples of the literary canon today. You can see here a copy of the Canterbury Tales, which is dated to around 1400, which is the year of Chaucer's death. Also shown here is a late 14th century copy of Langland's Piers Plowman, with a unique representation of Will the Dreamer, whose dreams form the narrative of the poem. And this image is regularly used to illustrate modern scholarly texts, such as the cover to the Cambridge Companion to Piers Plowman. Now, I'm pleased to say that full sets of these two images of these two manuscripts were made available to the public in 1995, very much in the forefront of sort of digitalization. And these images, alongside those of 7 other Corpus highlights, have now been migrated to the digital Bodleian platform. So this platform gives these images a new online life for scholars, or for those who just want to see in more detail some of the treasures I've already mentioned. And we do hope in time to be able to add to this collection. It's a wonderful facility that the Bodleian have shared with the community in Oxford. But if you go to the web address here, you can just search for Corpus Christi College, and you should find our manuscripts listed there. Now, moving away from the Western collection, among the 37 Greek manuscripts held by Corpus is a copy of Aristotle's biological works, which is seen here on the left. Now, this was written in Constantinople in the mid-9th century. It has been preserved at Corpus Christi College since 1623, when it was presented by good old Henry Parry. This manuscript is described as being of truly outstanding importance and is probably the oldest surviving manuscript of the text that founded the science of biology. And I have also included an image from a 15th century collection of Aristotle works, just for comparison about what's more of a workaday document to something that was illustrated possibly for a donor. I hope you will forgive the occasional pauses for refreshment, but I'll explain later why I've been talking a lot today, so I want to make sure my voice lasts. So, continuing the non-Western theme, our collection of Hebrew manuscripts, although small, contains what has been described as the most important Anglo-Jewish collection of manuscripts in the world. At the collection's core are 7 biblical manuscripts given to Corpus by John Clayman, the first president. Each text features an interlineary or superscript translation, which you can see here as a word-for-word translation of the Hebrew, alongside the 2 Latin versions of the Psalms. Jewish and Christian scribes produced such texts in collaborative effort during the 13th century to provide tools for non-Jews to learn Hebrew. 2 of the college's copies were produced here in Oxford, including the manuscript that you can see here. Another manuscript that was produced in England in the 1230s contains part of Rushdie's commentary of the Bible, and that manuscript also has idiosyncratic vocalization of the Hebrew, which has enabled scholars to understand how 13th century Christian students might have produced the language they were learning. I mean, how they would have sounded it, how it might have been pronounced. Now, in addition to these 7 manuscripts, the collection contains a near complete 12th century copy of Rushdie's biblical commentaries and an Ashkenazi prayer book. Now, in this pocket-sized volume, the owner, a Jew from Spain, living in England, recorded different debts owed to him by a variety of Christian dignitaries, which we can date to around the year 1200 because of the people quoted, and it does include the then Bishop of Winchester. Now, the owner wrote these business transactions in Judeo-Arabic. So here you have on the left the Hebrew text, the prayer book, and then on the Judeo-Arabic here on the right. Now, that is Arabic written in Hebrew characters, and this document is the only one of its kind. There are no texts surviving or have known to have been written in this language in the British Isles during the entire Middle Ages. The National Library of Israel, I'm pleased to say, now has a full set of the images of our Hebrew manuscripts, and they've made them available to the public for free on their Ketiv database. And again, as before, you can just search for Corpus on there and you'll get a list of all the different manuscripts that we have, the images of which we've shared. Now, the manuscripts are fascinating in themselves and for what they reveal about their donors. And there were recent descriptive catalogues for the Greek, Hebrew and Western collections. But as I said before, at foundation though, Corpus Library was unlike collections held by older institutions in the university. The books were nearly all print, and they were designed to support Fox's adherence to the reformed syllabus of the university. The books the college received early on reflect the library's essential role in delivering Fox's humanist curriculum. Fox's statutes are fascinating in that they laid down in great detail the texts and the authors to be read on certain days by his 3 herbalists for Latin, Greek and Divinity. And there was a greater emphasis on the provision of teaching in college. Now, both Fox and first president John Clayman ensured that the library received copies of practically all the Latin texts prescribed for study in the statutes, as well as the Greek classics listed there. Now, the provision of Greek texts is significant. There is no evidence in surviving books or from any other records that any Greek book had a place in another college library before 1535. I mean, individual scholars owned them, but not other libraries. So Corpus had the largest collection of Greek books in pre-Reformation Oxford, and so no wonder it was considered one of the finest libraries for the study of classics, the Latin and Greek texts, in the first half of the 16th century. Now, these texts were studied for the elegance of their style and their language, but also as essential for the study of scripture and theology. And Greek had been taught sporadically in Oxford prior to 1517, but our founder, Bishop Fox, apologies, it's skipped through. I shall try not to lean on buttons again and continue. So yes, our founder, Bishop Fox, was the first to fund a regular set of public lectures in Greek for Oxford. And Fox led the way with donations, presenting at least 137 books to the college, and we still have as many as 120 of those in the collection today. And over 100 of them were printed books, including 73 printed before 1500, which are some of the incunabula that I mentioned before. So Fox's donation was very strong in classical texts and commentaries, with only about 30 of his books covering other subjects. Now, some of the Latin texts came from his own personal collection, and they show annotation in Fox's hand. Others he collected with the apparent foundation of his college in mind. We do not think Fox read much Greek himself, so he did not collect over the years such titles for his use, but he did equip the library with printed first editions. These include many from the famous Venetian press of Aulus Manutius, with evidence in the college archives of payment for Greek texts being transported in barrels to Oxford from London. John Clayman, the first president and a humanist scholar, gave approximately 80 Greek and Latin texts and commentaries, including 25 manuscripts. Many of Clayman's books still remain in the library, and some from his substantial personal collection are heavily annotated in his hand. In 1521, Clayman acquired for the college nearly 50 books from the library of William Grocyn, the cleric and the first English Greek tutor at Oxford, and 35 of those texts remain in the collection today. As well as buying newly printed texts, Corpus was also able to help with the publication of new editions. In 1531, Corpus lent a college manuscript of Proclus on Euclid's Elements to the editor Simon Granitius, who used this text as the basis for the first printed edition. The manuscript was returned to the college bearing red chalk marks from the Basel printer Johann Havegan, who has marked off the page endings for the printed edition. And you can just see sort of faint red marks on this image here. Granitius presented a copy of the first printed edition to Clayman, who left it to the college. So both the manuscript and the printed copies remain in the library today, and it's a lovely connection to have. So, although ours was a collection that grew through donation, it was a disciplined, not a random accrual in the college's opening decades. Fox and Clayman didn't use their national or scholarly networks to secure donations. Rather, it was a library built from within by presidents, fellows, and other early members. Books themselves were the usual donation. It was only in 1597, with a bequest from a fellow, William Cobb, that the library had a regular income of £10 a year to spend on the purchase of books. And there were reforms 304 years ago, on the 26th of March 1717, which established the annual visitation or inspection that still takes place every year. And I have to say that my annual inspection took place this morning, which is why I'm rather talked out. But at least the visitation was set up 3 years after an annual stipend for the librarian was agreed. So how do we know so much about the early history of the library's collections? There is much we can glean from our earliest surviving library catalogue, which was produced in 1589. Now, as you can see here, it's a well-worn document, and it lists 371 books, and about 340 of these are still in the college today. Now, this is a remarkable and unusually high survival rate. And we can see from this catalogue that Clayman's gifts, along with Fox's, form the core of the Corpus Early Library. And through records such as these and the evidence in surviving books, we can see that donations continue to build the library. These gifts also illustrate the interests of individual scholars. And Corpus Library has been described as having one of the most important collections of early books in any college, whether at Oxford or at Cambridge, and one that reflects vividly the tastes and achievements of the earliest members of the college. Now, I have to admit, the 1540s and the 1550s were dry years for library donations, and that's probably because the political and religious confusion deterred donors. The next big donation after Fox and Claymont came from the 5th president of Corpus, who was in post 1562 to 68. Now, Thomas Greenway bequeathed 76 early printed books to the library in 1571. And these included the first works of Reformation theology to enter the library. So I think once it was very established, they were happy to donate. And amongst this gift were 2 volumes by Luther that were actually previously owned by Thomas Cranmer, which is a lovely positive connection for us to have. The religious upheavals of the 16th century did affect Corpus members. For example, John Jewell, who was notary to Cranmer and Ridley, was deprived of his fellowship under Queen Mary and fled abroad in 1555. He returned in 1559 with the change of queen and became the Bishop of Salisbury. Now, Jewell was devoted to preaching and the spiritual well-being of those in his care. Jewell published his sermons. A copy of his defence of the newly established Church of England is included in the 1589 catalogue. One of Jewell's protégés was Richard Hooker. He was a scholar at Corpus and became a fellow in 1577, then deputy professor of Hebrew. His monumental work of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity was published in the 1590s, the last decade of his life, although it was later reissued and frequently re-edited. The library has a large collection of Hooker's works, but these didn't actually come from the author himself. We did receive individual volumes given by 17th century members such as Rosewell, Fulman and Norgrove, but there is also a collection of all the editions published in the 17th century, which was presented by the Reverend Simmons to the president of Corpus in 1911. And we also hold a copy of the 1863 edition of Hooker's Laws, which through various reissues was to remain the standard version for over 100 years. This key version was edited by a 19th century corpuscle, John Keble of the Oxford movement. Now today, roughly half of the early printed collection is of a theological nature, encompassing Bibles and biblical commentaries, editions of church fathers, works of ecclesiastical history, and major contributors such as Erasmus and Thomas More, as well as the literature of contemporary debate and polemic. The library holds numerous editions and translations of the Book of Common Prayer, including the first edition of 1549. However, another version stands out as especially significant. This is a 1559 edition by Richard Grafton, which contains unusual 16th century manuscript editions in the forms of the signatures of Queen Elizabeth's privy councillors, as you can see here with the transcription. Now, translations themselves played a key part in the history of Corpus. Corpuscles, as Corpus members are known, played a significant role in the translation that led to the King James Bible of 1611. Now, John Reynolds was the 7th president of Corpus Christi from 1598 until his death in 1607. And he was active in the college, in the university, and on the national stage. So Reynolds oversaw the renovation of the library that I mentioned earlier. He was a Greek scholar and lecturer at the university. But Reynolds also attended the Hampton Court Conference in 1604 as a Puritan delegate, where his idea for the new translation of the Bible was adopted by James I. Now, the task was divided between 6 groups of scholars. 2 were based in Oxford, 2 in Cambridge, and 2 in London. A later committee then met in the Stationers' Hall in London to ensure harmony across the translation by the 6 groups of scholars. Reynolds was a member of the Oxford Company charged with the translation of the prophets from the Old Testament. The project started in 1605, but Reynolds was in poor health, so the group met in Reynolds' presidential lodgings in the Gatehouse at Corpus 3 times a week. They even met during the last week before his death, with Reynolds reportedly working from his deathbed. And in the years this project took, the translators used ancient Greek, Latin and Hebrew texts, including those at Corpus. Now, Reynolds obviously valued the library. As well as renovating it, he bequeathed over 150 books to Corpus, and we actually received more than was listed in his will. Now, as you'd expect, most of these works were theological, but the exceptions were also interesting. De Brye's Descriptio Americae is an encyclopedic depiction of the New World from 1592. It is a compilation of travel narratives illustrated by engravings. These show graphic images of cannibalism, but also more equitable encounters between Europeans and Native Americans, as well as the depictions of native plants and animals. There were other works bequeathed concerning birds and insects and plants, and these may have been acquired by Reynolds to assist in his translation work. His successor as president, John Spencer, was another corpuscle involved in the King James Bible. He was part of the Westminster Company that translated the epistles of the New Testament, Romans through Jude. Spencer died in 1614, and his donation of 58 books includes a polyglot dictionary, likely to have been used by the translators. And you can see fine memorials to both presidents in the college chapel, and hopefully you'll actually get a chance to see it yourself when we ever reopen to the public. So Corpus does, of course, have a first edition of the 1611 King James Bible. And we also have a rare record relating to the translation given by a 17th century corpuscle. Now, William Fulman bequeathed to the library 26 volumes of miscellaneous manuscripts. And this includes, as you see here, Fulman's own copy of the original notes by John Boys. These detail the discussion of the final revision of the translation, which was made at the Stationers' Hall in London in 1610. The notes are in at least 3 different languages, Latin, Greek and English, and only 2 other copies of Boys's notes are known to exist. Antiquarians like Fulman provided the college with a rich and varied collections. In addition to the volumes he compiled, he also gave many individual works, such as the Old and Middle English treasures of the library mentioned earlier. Now, these bequests are illuminating as personal libraries of scholars who collected material that interested them and which is rare and unusual now. And the scholars ensured the preservation of their collections by passing them to their college library. We endeavour to get the balance right between preserving the material and making it available to the public. And scholars usually come from all over the world for academic work with our collections. While we have no display space in college, we regularly lend to those institutions that do. In recent years, these have included the Palatinate Museum in Speyer, Compton Burney, the V&A, the British Library for their 2015 Magna Carta exhibition, and the Bodleian, most recently in 2019 for Babel, Adventures in Translation. To celebrate our quincentenary, we also organised a significant exhibition in Washington, DC and New York of 52 items. Now, 49 of these were library treasures, but there were also 2 pieces of the Founder's Plate, which form part of the college's silver collection, which is otherwise on display at the Ashmolean. And we produced a booklet to commemorate this exhibition, also in 2017. Now, one of the greatest antiquarian benefactors of Corpus Library was fellow Brian Twine. He was Professor of Greek at Corpus, but also the first archivist for Oxford University. Now, in 1644, he bequeathed to the college about 350 volumes containing about 750 works. These printed works and manuscripts cover a wide variety of subjects, including Greek studies, grammar and rhetoric, history and antiquarianism, medicine, astrology, horticulture, navigation, military science, and household management. There are alchemical works amongst the 73 manuscripts that had belonged to John Dee, the Elizabethan polymath. It's the variety that makes this collection so interesting. It's fascinating that alongside scholarly works, you can find out how to shoe a horse or grow an orchard. And Twine's books are also a personal collection. It seems fitting that the man known to play the lute should also include books about performing music in his collection. And Twine's library was rich in vernacular works or ephemeral ones, and many of the titles, although commonplace then, are extremely rare now. So the two titles on display here are both unique editions that only Corpus holds. And as you can see, the one on the left is actually a text that was translated by Lawrence Twine, who was Brian Twine's uncle. So there's a paper in the Oxford Bibliographic Society series by Ovenall, which explores this fascinating collection further. Bequests like Twine's represent libraries within libraries. All our donations reveal something of their donors beyond their scholarly endeavours. I've already mentioned a theological donation by President Greenway. In addition to a few classical, historical and mathematical titles, Greenway also gave a 1561 edition of the works of Chaucer. This was very much a personal choice. Chaucer is now so much part of the curriculum that it's hard to remember that the School of English at Oxford was only founded in the 1890s. And I have to confess, this was in the teeth of opposition from within the university, including the then president of Corpus, Thomas Fowler, who did not consider English literature an appropriate subject for an Oxford degree. So perhaps I should be relieved that I got my English degree from somewhere other than Oxford. Vernacular literary printed works continue to be given by donors such as Brian Twine and John Rosewell, and these include early 17th century London printings of Ben Jonson's Sejanus His Fall and The Alchemist, as you see here, one of only two known copies of Henry Constable's Diana from 1592, and copy of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, The Shepherd's Calendar, and other works printed in 1611. Corpus also has a copy of Shakespeare's Comedies, History, Tragedies, the so-called Second Folio, but sadly no first. The Second Folio is dated from 1632 and was given by Thomas Turner, who was president at Corpus at the beginning of the 18th century. And given by Twine is the somewhat surprising holding for an Oxford College library, Cervantes' Don Quixote, published in Madrid in 1608. But perhaps it was not so surprising. Corpus men seem to have been very outward looking. So Edward Pocock was the first Laudian professor of Arabic at Oxford, appointed in 1636. His university career as an Oriental and biblical scholar started at Corpus in 1620. He was the finest linguist ever produced by Corpus, learning Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, Syriac, and later studying Judeo-Arabic. Pocock was the chaplain to the Levant Company at Aleppo for 6 years from 1630, with the aim of studying Arabic language and literature at the source, and he travelled throughout the area collecting manuscripts for Archbishop Laud. Pocock's translation of the Specimen Historiae Arabum by Bar Hebraeus is considered his most important work, as it treated Arabic literature as a subject worthy of study in its own right. That work and the Porta Moses, which is Pocock's translation of Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah, are also significant for being the first works printed with the Arabic and Hebrew types, respectively, that Laud acquired for the Oxford University Press. The Corpus copies that you see here were given by Pocock shortly after their publication in the 1650s. We treasured these as well as copies of his later works, but sadly we don't have a copy of his pamphlet on the virtues of drinking coffee. Now, there were other Corpus scholars whose intellectual curiosity and sense of adventure led them to travel to Western Europe and beyond. A number followed Pocock's footsteps and joined the Levant Company as chaplains. In such a role, they could make the most of the opportunity to travel, learn languages, and collect material for books and posterity. Now, William Halifax was a fellow at Corpus in 1682. As chaplain at the Levant Company, he spent 6 years in Aleppo till 1695. Now, he was one of the first Westerners to visit the ancient city of Palmyra, and he later published an account of his visit. Halifax bequeathed the treasures he collected to Corpus. As well as approximately 40 Italian printed works, there are 2 beautiful Arabic manuscripts, a 15th century Quran and a copy of the Psalms. The college also has a silver gilt basin, the Halifax Bowl, that you can see here, and a collection of coins and medals that he bought on his travels. The role of chaplain could take Corpus members in almost any direction. Richard James came to Corpus on a scholarship and became a fellow in 1617. A year later, he embarked as chaplain to the English embassy to Russia, led by Sir Dudley Digges. Now, diplomatically, the mission was a failure, but James used the time he spent in Moscow and then trapped in Russia by winter seas to study the country, its people, their language and culture. Notes written by James survive in the Bodleian Library. These preserve his record of vocabulary and songs, which reflect the real spoken usage in 17th century Russia. They include also the first recorded reference in any language to the mammoth. Now, corpuscles were also involved in the colonization of America. George and Edwin Sands attended Corpus in the 1570s and 80s. They were involved in the early days of the Virginia Company, which was chartered under James I in 1606, with the aim of establishing settlements on the east coast of North America. Now, Edwin participated in negotiations with the Puritans at Leyden, which led to the Mayflower and the Pilgrim Fathers' journey in 1620. The Corpus connection with America can also be seen in the 18th century. General James Oglethorpe was at Corpus in 1714, and he's credited with founding the state of Georgia. Oglethorpe's contribution to Corpus Library includes 2 volumes of the so-called Oglethorpe Bible, a 16th century French translation of the historical books of the Old Testament. These lavish tomes were apparently made by the order of the French king, Francis I. The illustrations are in 3-dimensional style, which reflects panel painting rather than the tradition of manuscript illumination, as you can see here with the Garden of Eden. Now, Oglethorpe bought these volumes in France in 1720, but they were confiscated by customs at Dartford, and although 2 were reclaimed, the 3rd volume was never recovered or received by Corpus. We have another American connection in Thomas Crowder, who was a soldier who travelled widely before becoming bursar of Corpus in 1874. The college has 16 volumes of his detailed notebooks, which record his extensive travels in Europe in the 1850s. They also contain his impressions of New York and Washington, D.C. during his visits there during the American Civil War. Crowder spent 2 years in New Brunswick in the 1680s, training militia and volunteers. Crowder's journal entries record his honest impressions of the tobacco-chewing and spitting soldiers, noting, "Now on leaving America, I can only say that I am thankful I am an Englishman and far separated from this most irreverential race of beings." And I apologize to any Americans in the audience. Now, travel could be prompted by scholarly interest or inspire them. Henry Hare, 3rd Baron Coleraine, was at Corpus in 1714. And he subsequently undertook several grand tours of Italy and then bequeathed to the college 31 enormous albums of prints and engravings, such as this one of the Vatican Library that you can see. He also gave over 800 books on Italian history and topography. His donation was so large that it prompted the first expansion of library space, when a college room at the end of the original library was taken over to house it. This room was later subsumed into the president's lodgings when that moved around the college. But when the president finally left the main site and moved across the road to 3 Merton Street in the 1980s, the room was returned to library use, and it's remained part of the library ever since. And moving through the years, James Legge spent decades in the Far East before returning to England and becoming the first professor of Chinese at Oxford University in 1876. This early and prolific translator of Chinese classical texts was given a fellow stipend at Corpus in 1875. Legge was the first nonconformist to achieve a professorship and supported the foundation of Somerville College in 1879, the first non-denominational college of Oxford University, and obviously one of the first two female colleges as well. A new biography of this fascinating scholar and missionary from Scotland was published in 2016. The library has a large number of Legge's publications, including a copy of his scholarly edition of the Chinese classics, which he presented to the college himself. But this is not the only work relating to Chinese held at Corpus. We also have an early 15th century edition of four classics, which was presented to the college by John Goodkin, who was at Corpus in 1632. So it's been at Corpus for over 350 years. So far, we've identified 31 languages represented in the college collections, including Old English, Catalan, and even a few words of 15th century Czech. But the intellectual curiosity of corpuscles can also be seen in their pursuit of science, and this is reflected by the manuscript and print holdings of the college library. 30 or so of the college's medieval manuscripts were concerned with science, covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, zoology, and botany. The collection has also been described as a goldmine for the historian of medieval chemistry and alchemy. The field of astronomy has generated gifts for the library. Brian Twine, although better known as a historian of Oxford, was equally interested in science and is credited as one of the first Englishmen to refer to the telescope. Now, the successful application of this invention had been reported by Galileo in his 1610 publication Sidereus Nuncius, and Twine's own copy of the first edition of this text is preserved in the library today. And here you can see the illustrations of the moon as seen through the telescope, which are hand-drawn rather than printed in most editions. Swithin Adey, who became a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in 1763, was responsible for a particularly important donation. Now, this is the 17th century correspondence of John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, with various contemporary astronomers. And the collection includes 27 autograph letters by Isaac Newton to Flamsteed. So this includes Newton's correspondence that you can see here relating to the passing of the Great Comet over Cambridge in 1680 and 81. And it incorporates Newton's drawing of the comet, which was seen over King's College Chapel, which I'll just enlarge for you there, so you can see that it talks about the tail of the comet passing over the chapel. And this letter notably records Newton's objections to Flamsteed's theory that this was actually one comet rather than two, an idea Newton later adopted without giving any credit to Flamsteed. Still in the field of astronomy, Thomas Hornsby came to Corpus in the mid-18th century and was later elected Oxford Savalian Professor of Astronomy and Professor of Experimental Philosophy. Now, Hornsby spearheaded the building of the University Observatory, furnishing it with instruments at his own expense. Several of his notebooks survive at Corpus. Hornsby has been described as a remarkably accurate observer, and in 1973, a lunar crater was named in his honour. The library's printed collection includes many milestones in the development of science. Complementing Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius and Flamsteed's correspondence are works by Copernicus, Kepler, and a selection of astronomical works by Halifax, which were published in Gdansk. These donations reflect the personal interests of fellows. However, it can also be seen that the college was determined not to wait for gifts or bequests in order to keep its collections up to date, as it bought key texts often within a year or two of publication. Now, mathematics is well represented in the library. Among the various noteworthy editions, there is a luxury copy of Cuthbert Tunstall's De Artes Seputanti of 1522. Now, this presentation copy from the author, printed on vellum and edged in gold, was the first book printed in England entirely dedicated to mathematics. Later in the same century, another copy of this text, this time on paper, was presented by President Greenway. The college purchased a copy of Newton's Principia upon its first publication in 1687, and holds a copy of the 1713 second edition. The library also acquired a copy of Newton's Optics, published in London in 1704, and has a copy of Euclid's Elements in Arabic, which was printed in Rome in 1594. Printed works on anatomy, botany, and medicine entered the library right from its foundation, some provided by the founder and the first president. 16th century printed works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Vesalius, amongst others, all appear in the 1589 catalogue I mentioned earlier. The Vesalius texts, although large, almost luxury volumes, have been heavily annotated as working copies of anatomy. And I have to say, every page is like this. It's incredible to see. This particular copy probably came to the college from William Nicholson, who became a fellow in 1573. And another addition is that on some of the pages, the sex organs have been cross-hatched to preserve the modesty of the models, or perhaps those who are studying them. And remember Brian Twine? Amongst his large bequest are the medical books which belonged to his father Thomas, who also studied at Corpus. The collection includes early works in English on a variety of medical topics, including Timothy Bright's A Treatise of Melancholy, works on midwifery and venereal disease, and texts relating to the application of plants and herbs from the New World. William Creed, a qualified physician who came to Corpus in 1676, donated to the library over 100 contemporary medical and botanical works, which complement Twine's bequest. The medical texts at Corpus include those documenting information and treatments, such as Culpeper's Directory for Midwives. There are also texts detailing new scientific discoveries, often by Oxford-based experimental philosophers such as Wilkins, Lower, Sydenham, and Boyle. Recognition of the significance of Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, is reflected by the number of copies of his works given by fellows to the library throughout the 17th century. 2 years after its publication in 1666, a copy of Cerebrae Anatomiae with engravings by Christopher Wren was bought for the library. Now, although its author and the founder of clinical neurosciences was a Christchurch man, Thomas Willis was at this time living in a Corpus property. Beam Hall on Merton Street was acquired by the college in 1553 and is still owned by the college today. So you can see a plaque commemorating Willis on its wall, so we sort of claim him too. And a book by another Oxford man, Robert Hooke, was bought by the library in 1667, the year it was published. Micrographia shows the results of Hooke's observations with the microscope and telescope. It seems an appropriate acquisition for Corpus, as it includes the first description of the sting of a bee, which is illustrated by the image in the middle here. Now, books can be special because of who owned them, rather than just how long they've been at the college. A copy of Harvey's Anatomical Exercises from 1673, for example, only came to the library 13 years ago. Now, this text is amongst the medical works of the library of a trained doctor and poet laureate. So Robert Bridges came to Corpus in 1863, and his personal library of about 500 books was donated to the college by the Bridges Library in 2008. This 21st century accession illustrates this archetypal Corpus man. Bridges was an industrious scholar, like an ingenious bee. He had multiple interests, as well as medicine and poetry. There was travel, music, drama, and sport. He was known as a distinguished oarsman. He learnt languages such as German and Italian, whilst also campaigning to preserve the purity of the English language. Bridges' endeavours were recognised by his college. He was presented with an honorary fellowship in 1893. His achievements were reflected in his national honours. Bridges was appointed Poet Laureate in 1913 and was later awarded the Order of Merit. And we are honoured that his family trusted Bridges' own college with his working collection, as well as including presentation copies from poets who had looked up to Bridges. And how do we look after these historic and special collections? The books are part of our history and our future, and are as important to the identity of Corpus as the buildings that house them. The early printed books were moved out from the original library in the 1960s. The modern stock was moved in, and current members were given access to a generous library space 24 hours a day. All the historic books and special collections remain on the main site. They're kept in air-conditioned strong rooms and are made available by appointment to scholars who come from Corpus, from Oxford, and from the UK more widely, and from all over the world. And I'm pleased to say the original library building continues to be used as the library, as it has done since our foundation 504 years ago. So thank you for listening to me rattle through all of that, and for the occasional click happiness of my presentation. I'm very happy to go back to any images anyone wants to see, but I'll just stop sharing at the moment so that we can say hello to each other.
Thank you very much indeed. That was truly fascinating and a bit mind-blowing. We're so grateful it's going to be available on the YouTube, we hope, all being well, technical being well, so that we can go back in greater detail. I know Erasmus was could be a bit critical, but I'm sure, although the Vatican still might be in certain respects better, I'm sure he would be very impressed by what has succeeded, what he saw. So it's a truly astonishing collection there.
Yes, I remember when I was appointed, a friend of mine said, "How does it feel to be in charge of a library that Erasmus praised?" And I have to say, I'd rather you didn't say that at this point.
So I don't think there's a question in chat, so I'll just give people, oh yes there is. So if you have recovered your voice enough, I'm sorry it's been such a heavy day for you.
No, that's all right.
Was any of the royal court located at Corpus during the Civil War? And did any naughty courtier try and borrow a book that he couldn't?
There's a couple of nice Civil War stories, actually, because Charles I was at Christchurch, and Henrietta Maria, of course, was at Merton. And so we have the King Charles Gate, which is a gate between Corpus and Christchurch, which the king was supposed to have used when he wanted to trot across and visit the Queen without having to go out onto the street with the hoi polloi. But I don't think we had any specific royal court that I'm aware of, any particular names. The other Civil War story is probably apocryphal, but we have the earliest hallmark gold in England, and we have quite a significant sort of pre-Reformation plate collection. And most of the colleges gave up their plate to the king when he was in Oxford. And the idea is that Corpus buried theirs in the garden, so we didn't. I'm sure we didn't do that. We probably just gave him money instead. But it's a nice story to think about.
Yes, so there'll possibly be another one coming up. While there isn't, this is sad. Possibly everybody knows I'm a librarian too. So the thing that struck me was when your first library fund, as it were, was £10 back in the 16th century. Now, was that considered well, yes, I think 16th century still. Was that considered, do you know whether the incumbent thought, wow, this is a wonderful amount of money, I'm going to be able to buy zillions of everything? Or
I don't know. I really don't know quite how it compared to other college libraries at the time. I mean, obviously the library was built largely through donation, so there wasn't that much we were buying at that stage. I mean, the evidence we have in the archives are more for building related things. So many pennies were paid for 18 chains for the library, that kind of thing. So we have more detail about that. No, it's a curious sum. I mean, I suppose it's relatively generous of its time. But I think the stipend for the librarian, which came later, actually came, it was the income generated by a field called the Librarian's Field. So there's part of one of the college estates somewhere that's called the Librarian's Field.
Isn't Littlemore by any chance? Because you have Corpus
I think it might,
or had land at Littlemore.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So it might well be there, but I'm just glad I'm not reliant on it now. So.
No. So a question has come in. Do you still acquire historic books?
Well, we don't buy them. We don't have a fund for that. We're not like some of our grander neighbours who I know do have a budget for buying historic material. But we are very lucky that we do still get donations. So obviously the Bridges Library was one. We also got a donation of about 30 early printed books from the Galty family. The father died. And his three sons, the father had been at Corpus, the three sons had also been at Corpus, and they agreed that the college was the best place to keep the collection together, which is nice. And we have other academics who have promised to bequeath their collections to us, which it will be really special. Again, there'll be more libraries of libraries for us to hold, but we don't acquire generally. And one of our major problems, as I'm sure you will have said yourself, is problems with space, and that's a real issue. But I should perhaps share that we are very hopeful to build a library extension, possibly even starting this year, which will be great. So if that does come together, then we will have better equipped spaces and a little bit of growth space too for the collection. So we're looking forward to that.
Right, so another member is asking, was the role of librarian specialised in the early modern period, or did fellows act as librarians?
I think fellows acted as librarians. We don't have the evidence that, say, Merton does for their sort of lending collection, where they actually had books that detailed books being lent for sums of money and those kinds of things. And we think those kinds of records may have been kept by the bursar and the president at that point. We have some chests that require two people to unlock it at the same time and all those kind of security measures. So I don't think there certainly wasn't anybody that known just as the librarian. I would assume that there was a fellow appointed to look after the sort of the circulating collection and to oversee the reference collection. So it was only later, at the beginning of the 18th century, that there was a sort of librarian stipend, so a librarian was appointed. And obviously in more modern terms, we've only had professional librarians since the 20th century, so fairly late in the day, I think, compared to some.
Thank you. And sort of follow-up question. Do you have a sense of how the library was used? I think this is in the earliest period. Was it in any way a sociable space? Or did the busy bees just swat away industriously?
Well, you do wonder, don't you? I mean, it has been in continuous use as a library, but I should confess that the undergraduates were not given access until the 1860s. So it was very much a place reserved for the fellows to work and to use. I mean, we did have a separate junior library as well from the 1930s to the 60s, which is actually in a room, an extension to the old library that we still use today. But I've seen pictures and that looked much more like a gentleman's club. It was the smoking room and things that you really don't expect in a library at all. But I don't know about the early tradition. I mean, certainly some of the scholars that come are quite surprised how clean our books are, in terms of there aren't that many annotations. There are some that are heavily annotated, as I've shown, but quite a lot that aren't. So there is that suggestion that possibly they weren't as well used as perhaps they should have been, given Fox's statutes and his determination to stick to the new syllabus. But Fox certainly outlined in his statutes too about the library. He had very good advice of look to the windows lest the wind and the rain come in. And I do actually have to remind our current students about that sometimes when they leave the windows open when the rain does come in.
So I just think we might be just about to release you, but I've got one question. How on earth do you look after a sealskin chemise, or does it just look after itself?
It's actually very stable, which is nice. Yes, I think the worry would be any insect damage. Yeah. So it is in its own acid-free box, carefully a bespoke box made by the Bodleians boxing service. So it's kept securely and very rarely produced, to be honest. It is quite a difficult thing to handle because as well as the sealskin chemise, it's also got metal studs in, so we obviously have to be very careful. But the texts it holds are also very interesting. One of them is a life of St. Olaf. So we did have people coming from Norway on a sort of pilgrimage to England, and they wanted to stop, and they weren't interested in the chemise at all. They wanted to see the life of St. Olaf. So it's getting the balance right between looking after the bindings and the material inside. But they're kept in air-conditioned strong rooms and looked after very, very carefully by the college. But it's certainly one of our more challenging items. We don't have much in the way of objects, so we have the odd leather fire bucket and one textile and things like that. But Corpus held onto its books, but it didn't really hold onto its objects. So we had globes from the 17th century, and they disappeared within a century.
All right. Yes.
Unlike other colleges. So, but I guess I'm just grateful they held on to the books.
Indeed, we all. So I think it's been a fascinating evening, and yes, you're getting thanks coming in on the chat line there, and I've Googled on my other screen the Corpus Christi College website, and you need to bury down under the About Corpus link there. I get very cross when they don't have library up in the first line of things.
I tried to fight that battle, but no, there were bigger college aims in mind. But yes, if you bury down under About Corpus, you get to the library pages.
Yes, and it looks absolutely fascinating. And that and the digital Bodleian and your YouTube. I mean, we're set up for another lockdown. God forbid we're not having one, but there is a lot of fascinating material and pretty pictures too, which is always a relief for those of us like me who aren't particularly great scholars. So on behalf of us all, I mean, Zoom is terrible with applause. Thank you so much. We are very grateful.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. I was delighted to be asked, given that I just missed out because it was just as lockdown was being imposed last year.
Yes, it was all one of those. Oh, dears. Anyway.
No, but it's been a pleasure, and thank you all for bearing with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.